Scripture reading for today, Ephesians 2, 11 through 22. The Apostle Paul is writing to a Gentile church in Ephesus. You may remember that originally most of the early church was Jewish. Jesus was Jewish, the disciples were Jewish, and most of Israel, where Jesus preached, was also Jewish. But the later Apostle Paul preached mostly to Gentiles. That's what the Jewish people called the non-Jewish people, Gentiles. So Paul preached mostly to non-Jewish people. And most of Paul's letters to the first churches were to churches that were either non-Jewish, Gentiles, or to churches that were a blend of Jewish and Gentile people. In his letter to the Ephesians, who were a Gentile church, Paul is reminding the Gentiles that they were originally completely outside of God's promise of salvation, since God had originally only promised to bless the people of Israel. But Jesus extends God's salvation to include all of those who believe in Jesus. And from our story today, maybe even larger. But both Jews and non-Jews. And so in our reading today, Paul is telling the Gentiles that they ought to be thankful that Jesus has included them in God's plan of salvation. But here's the rub. Here's the friction point. Jesus is intentionally creating the church by uniting two very different people from two very different cultures. For instance, the Jewish people worship one God, whereas the Gentiles would generally have worshipped many gods. The Gentiles would have originally had a different god for making the sun move in the sky, a different god to rule the seas, a different god to be the ruler of war, and a different god to create passionate love, and many other gods. So in the early church, you have two very different understandings about God. What God does and who God is. At the same time, the Gentiles, they eat ham, bacon, pork chops, and pork ribs. And they eat clams and oysters, and well, they don't really care what they eat. And so they also don't care about who they associate with. But the Jewish people are taught a whole different way of life. They are very picky about what they eat, and they are very picky about who they associate with. Some foods and some peoples are simply unclean. Now, you can imagine how the everyday Gentile people who would have felt about being considered, now you are the Gentiles, by the way, would have been considered to be unclean, how they would have felt. And if they brought some tasty ham casserole or ham hock to the church dinner, then the formerly Jewish Christians snub their nose there a little bit at these Gentile ham delicacies. Well, that probably would have caused a bit of hard feelings. So, we're not good enough for you, eh? Oh, and so our food is not good enough for you, eh? Unclean, even. So the Gentile Christians would have had their difficulties in accepting and getting along with the formerly Jewish Christians. And the formerly Jewish Christians would have had their own difficulties accepting and getting along with their Gentile Christians. And yet, you know what? And yet, this must be exactly what Jesus wanted to happen. Because Jesus brings together two very different kinds of people. Two very different cultures in order to form the church. And you know what? That would have been the perfect type of situation for the first Christians to have to learn and practice some of the core principles of Christianity. That natural friction, that natural tension between these two peoples would have required them to practice patience. It would have required them to try to be graceful toward the other person, because maybe that other person just don't want to eat ham after not being allowed to eat ham their whole life. Or you might have to give a little understanding towards that other person because they don't realize that you don't have to sacrifice to the fertility gods to ensure a healthy baby. You just have to trust in and pray for the mercy of the one God. Patience, understanding, trying not to judge the other person, gracefulness, choosing to look for the best in the other person, choosing to overcome your natural distrust of someone who comes from such a different place in life. These are some of the core Christian values that the early Christians would have been practicing every day just to stay together as a congregation. And continually practicing these gifts of love and understanding would create a place where differences are accepted. And if the church got really good at practicing these gifts of love and understanding, they might actually come to see their differences as opportunities to gain new insights into another culture, into another people. Insights into what actually makes us more like the other person. At camp this past week, I was talking with someone. Their Lutheran women's group invited a group of Muslim women to talk with their Lutheran women's group. And this lady was saying how she was actually surprised at how much the Muslim women were like her, like everyone else. These particular Muslim women did not wear the headscarf because they didn't want to. They said that it's actually optional. This and other things surprised the lady that I was talking to. You know, our society is made up of many different types of people, many different cultures. You have your traditional separations, black, white, rich, poor, blue collar, white collar. You have gays and straights, and you have Democrats and Republicans, and our larger society has chosen to pit these groups against each other so that you have definite winners and losers. You are taught by the larger society that your group is the only valid group. Everything that your group thinks, does, and says is right. And everything that other group thinks and does and says is wrong. In fact, it is very wrong. In fact, it is hateful. In fact, you should hate them. That is what the world teaches you, and your children, and your neighbors, and your co-workers. Now, you and I should not be surprised at this development. The Gospel of John told us long, long ago that there is the realm of the world and there is the realm of the Spirit. Jesus fills the church with His Spirit of forgiveness, His Spirit of understanding and grace. This is how we operate as the church. We do not draw divisions, but rather we treat each other with respect and openness. No matter who you are, gay or straight, black or white, rich or poor, blue collar, white collar, Republican, Democrat, by treating all people of any race or culture, by treating all people with openness and understanding and grace, you actually expand who you are as a person. Rather than defining the other person or even defining yourself as a simple, narrow label, Jesus opens you up to know the other person more fully as a person. One of the most enriching spiritual things that you can do is to try to mentally put yourself into someone else's shoes. If you're white, into black. If you're rich, into poor. If you're white collar, blue collar. If you're Democrat, Republican. Try this little exercise. It's worth it because it helps you to a little bit understand where that other people are coming from. Our worship theme for today is tearing down walls. This is what Jesus does. This is what the Spirit of God does. In the church, in your heart and mind, may Jesus give you this gift of graciousness and understanding always. In the name of Jesus Christ.